My name is Dr. Chris Jenkins, and I am the CEO of the Orianne Society and the host of the Snake Talk podcast, the podcast where you learn about nature's most feared, maligned, and persecuted animals. I invite you to listen to this conversation, and maybe you'll find that what you perceive as fear is actually rooted in a deep fascination. Welcome to the Snake Talk podcast. We have an interesting one today. Recently, I was down in Arizona. I spent some time at the zoo in Phoenix and gave some seminars and worked with some students down at the University of Arizona. And while I was down at the university, I got to meet with Jim Hevelfinger, and we had some great conversations about snakes and deer and turkeys and just wildlife in general. And he suggested that I talked to a gentleman named Randy Babb, which was interesting because I had heard Randy's name multiple times. And so I was more than happy to connect him. And we have Randy with us today, who spent a lot of time in the Southwest, both working with wildlife, but then also really done some amazing things all over the world. And we're going to talk about all of that today. So welcome to the podcast, Randy. How are you?
I'm well, and thank you for calling me a gentleman.
Yeah, no problem. So I like to start right from the beginning and kind of figure out, how it is that people got into wildlife, people got into reptiles and amphibians, snakes, things of that nature. Because it's while it's pretty normal for us, it's really outside the box for a lot of people. And so, just curious to hear that story. How did you originally get into wildlife and reptiles and amphibians? Is it something that kind of hit you as a kid, or something more recent in life?
Oh no, we were. I grew up in an outdoor family. Father was a serious hunter and fisherman, and we grew up in that kind of environment, and our interest in wildlife was always encouraged. And since I was my earliest memories, all I wanted to do was play with animals. And so I looked for a career like that, and reptiles and amphibians were one of those things you could get your hands on. I'm sure if I could have caught deer and elk by hand when I was 10 years old, I would have done that too. But, unfortunate for the multitudes of frogs, toads, lizards, and snakes, I could grab those things and have a close look at them. And then a lot of them ended up at home, much to my mother's dismay. And, so just from there, it's never really changed.
Yeah. And so did you grow up there in Arizona?
Yeah. I grew up in a small town called Chandler, and Arizona's blessed with a lot of public land. And so it was easy to get out and crawl around, turn boards, climb hills, things like that, looking for animals.
Yeah. And Chandler, if I remember it, that's kind of east of Phoenix. Is that right?
Yeah, kind of south and to the east. And
Okay.
when I grew up, we had wood houses and Great Plains toads in the neighborhoods. And of course, Sonoran Desert toads were the big prize because they were so huge. And, lots of lizards and things like that. So right in the neighborhoods, we could spend our time playing with those things and chasing them and learning about them because, we all got a hold of books and things like that to try to find out what we were messing with.
Yeah. Huh. Well, it sounds like, we have a similar upbringing. I also grew up and still am like a very avid, hunter and angler, and kind of grew up in that environment with family and spent a lot of my time out catching, newts and frogs and things. So, but when was it that you kind of had this realization that this is something, that was even potentially a career, or something that you wanted to pursue? So was this something that, kind of in high school or was it not until you got to college or beyond? How did you figure out oh, I could do this for a living. It's not just recreation. It's not just a hobby.
Well, that's a really great question. I think I've always loved the sciences, and one of the few subjects I excelled at as a kid. Not so much a math guy and things like that, but so that was always an interest, and I always had even as a child, tremendous respect for scientists and the work they did, and um, I guess I never thought of myself really doing that until probably high school or so, and then thought, this could be a thing. I remember my grandmother telling me, you can't spend your whole life catching lizards, and turns out she was wrong. And so yeah, I just really, I think, buckled down and focused. I had other friends that were going that way, and we had a pretty tight knit group of folks that all ended up being professional biologists.
That's great. So did you end up then going to college to study anything about, say zoology or herpetology or ecology or whatever it might be, or were you in another field?
No, I was at ASU, and just kind of general biology stuff, and they keep changing all those names. It's conservation biology, but they're all pretty much the same degree. We all learn pretty much the same stuff, and made a lot of lifelong friends there that I'm still very close with.
Ah, okay. Excellent. And how did you meet Jim? Is that part of that stage of your life, or was that when you worked for the state?
Yeah, when I worked for the Arizona Game Fish Department, I bumped into Jim Heffelfinger, and always had a tremendous amount of respect for Jim. He's got a really good head on his shoulders and a real keen eye for looking at details and whatnot. And we had a very good mutual friend and a mutual mentor, Dave Brown, who did the Biotic Communities of the Southwest and wrote, I don't even know, 20 some odd books or something like that. And through him and through our work, we mixed up a lot. And I'm still very good friends with Jim and still think the world of him. He's an amazing guy.
Gotcha. So you're doing your undergrad there at Arizona State, and in conservation biology or biology in general, and then as it's coming time to graduate, are you? What was kind of your next move? Were you thinking about grad school? Were you thinking about moving into a career, getting a job? How did you? What happened
Yeah,
after your undergrad?
I certainly was thinking of a career, and I had a great opportunity to move right away into as a field tech for the Rocky Mountain Range and Extension Office that happened to be on the campus right there at ASU, and so I did that for about 3 years, and worked with a very good friend of mine at that time, Kevin Aiken. We went herping all the time together, every spare moment, and at that time, aside from just doing the general projects that field techs do, like grazing, or not a grazing impact, but one was goats, using goats to manage chaparral, did a lot of hydrology stuff and server samplers and things like that, doing stream fauna. But we were doing grazing impact studies on the Rio de la Vacas in northern New Mexico. And they would just turn Kevin and I loose up there for 2 weeks at a time, and then we'd get a week off and we'd go out in the field chasing lizards and snakes and stuff, and then just get back in time to go back to work. And so it was a really good life. We worked with a bunch of really great scientists, Bob Zarro and John Rennie and Dave Patton, a bunch of guys that were very influential, and just learned tons. That first job, I think, as you really start doing it, you pick up so many things that you didn't learn at school. It's pretty fantastic.
Mm-hmm. And you said you did that for 3 years. Is that so? You said it
Mm-hmm.
was at the university, but was it a university like a state job, or was it affiliated with another entity?
It was a federal job. It was working with the Forest Service, and
Oh, okay,
their
okay.
office just happened to be on campus there, so it was fantastic. So, yeah, the Rocky Mountain Range and Extension Office, and just after I left, they moved off campus and went up to Flagstaff,
You gotcha.
And that's about the time I switched over to the game and fish department.
Yeah. So, what was that transition like? Sounds like you had a long career at Game and Fish, and so after the Forest Service, what was it? Was it a particular job, or what was it that got you working for Game and Fish and starting that long career?
Yeah, I think growing up hunting and fishing, and always had a lot of respect for the game and fish department. And it may have not been the wisest financial move, but it certainly kept me in Arizona, and it kept me um, you know, doing working with an agency that I really had a lot of respect for. So I moved over there about '86, and was on contract work teaching people how to fish for a couple years, and that was a bad move because you didn't build any state time or
Hmm.
towards your retirement or benefits. So in that respect, but I got to rub shoulders with a lot of folks and whatnot, and then came on permanent after that.
Okay. And I really want to spend a lot of time talking about some of these adventures you've been on, but I will stick with Game and Fish for a little bit here. So you came on full time, and if I remember right, you had one primary role throughout your career trajectory there. Maybe it was like outreach education related. I may have that wrong. Um, and you may have also been you were like a district biologist or a wildlife biologist. Is that kind of how it played out
Yeah,
for you?
yeah. So yeah, I came on at the department at a time when things were just really changing, and they started the non-game department. But I was
Hmm.
working in the education branch
Okay.
for Kerry Baldwin, who was a really visionary wildlife guy, and so we did that, and I stuck with that in one form or another for the bulk of my career. I went from there over to the region in Mesa and worked, with some researchers on different projects, but also uh, primary focus was information education. Did a lot of writing, did lots of surveys and captures and all that kind of stuff, and it was a heck of a ride. And at the end of my career there, the last 4 years, I switched over to wildlife viewing, which I think has a huge future in the wildlife field, to engage non-traditional publics, people that don't hunt or fish, because that's primarily where a lot of these wildlife departments focus. And there's, most of the people don't hunt or fish, and so getting them involved in wildlife conservation and interested in wildlife and invested in that was a real passion. I thought it's going to be the future. It's
Yeah.
it's where we're all going to go.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier in the conversation, reptiles and amphibians being some of those animals you can actually put in your hands. And, so I'm curious, throughout this career where you spent quite a bit of time doing education outreach, did reptiles, amphibians, maybe snakes, did they play a role in that? Were you able to put a lot of reptiles and amphibians, say, in kids or adults' hands?
Yeah, matter of fact, that was a huge focus. So, uh, you know, smart supervisors always play to people's strengths and use them in their best capacities. You can, you know, making a hog do the backstroke is not a wise use of your time, but put them at a feed trough, they're going to perform for you. So uh, uh, we did a lot of field sessions that we used to call wildlife workshops. And these were geared for teachers because in Arizona, fourth grade teachers taught Arizona was the main subject for the fourth grade year. So the idea was to get these teachers, instead of just talking about, copper, cotton and cattle in Arizona, start talking about all our amazing wildlife. And so we would design these workshops where we took teachers out for a weekend. They usually went Friday and Saturday night and half the day Sunday. So they about midday or the afternoon of Friday to that time, and we go to all over the state doing different stuff. And one of the ones that we had that was a long running one was Herps for Twerps. It was named by Cecil Schwabe, actually,
Oh,
and the
really?
idea was to get teachers out and hands-on reptiles and amphibians, look at them, learn about them. And then this put the teacher, when they were talking to students, and said, yeah, Gila monsters feel like plastic, all bumpy and this kind of thing, and rattlesnakes rattle, tails do this and stuff. So it gave them a position of authority to talk about those different subjects instead of just a more esoteric or distance approach from a book or a video or something. And we did that with bats and wild turkeys and bears and bighorn sheep and heaven knows all the different things. It was really great. But herps was one of the big ones and one of the early ones that we started with.
Ah, okay. And you mentioned, you spent, time kind of as a regional biologist as well. I'm assuming in that role, kind of the scope of what you're doing would span kind of all kinds of wildlife, mammals, birds, maybe reptiles and amphibians, or maybe it was just kind of game species focused. But talk a little bit about that time, and really anything, kind of where those times or places where you might have had some overlap with reptile amphibian interest.
Yeah, working in the regions was fabulous because at the headquarters, I always kind of look at any bureaucracy. The headquarters is kind of like ground zero for the nuclear blast, and then the impacts lessen as you move further away out from it. So the regions, there was a little bit more freedom, and depending on your supervisor, you had more latitude to pursue topics that were mission oriented, but were more to your particular interest. And so I did a lot of reptile amphibian stuff. I did a lot of surveys, flying helicopters, counting elk. Or I didn't fly the helicopter. I rode in them. I usually got sick in them, actually, and then jumped out of helicopters on bighorn sheep, during captures, and netted sheep and elk and all kinds of different wildlife, remove things from people's backyards. But the herp stuff, I worked really closely with the non-game branch and the non-game people in the regions, and we often conspired on different projects. Like we did a turtle removal at the Phoenix Zoo at the entrance, and so the whole idea was, as the Rio Salado project was getting in, we were afraid that during high water years, flood events, that we might end up with a lot of exotic turtles in the Salt River system. So the whole idea was to minimize impacts of that. So we started just removing females and leaving males in place in an effort to drive down reproduction, but still give people the opportunity of seeing lots of turtles as they were there at the zoo in the pond. And we pulled out Jiminy Cricket stuff from 7 or 8 different continents, or not 7 continents. We let me think, from Asia, Africa, and Australia, and then all over North America, we were getting turtles. So there were alligator snapping turtles in there, common snappers, painted turtles, side neck turtles. I mean, it was just all over.
And I just saw that pond. I told you, I think I mentioned in the intro that I was at the zoo. So how did all of those turtles get there? Did the zoo put them there, or is it just over time people had been putting them there and the habitats favored the species?
Right. It was just kind of a dumping ground. So people would get pet turtles. And then when they didn't want them anymore, hey, let's take it to the zoo pond because there's turtles there. And so a tremendous variety of turtles ended up in there. And it was kind of astonishing as we were first trapping. And so some species were prohibited, so we removed those. But other ones, the idea was we didn't want to destroy the experience for the people, but we did want to be biologically responsible and minimize the opportunities for exotic species to colonize new habitats in the state. And so it good heavens, we removed about a metric ton of Trachome scripta, out of those ponds. And you probably saw a lot of turtles when you were just there.
Mm-hmm.
They're still doing well. So the opportunity to watch turtles is still around.
Yeah, that's great. So you've retired from game and fish, but you definitely, it seems like, continue to work. And I think, it sounds like a lot of the work that we're about to talk about kind of also spanned the time frame, before you retired. And what I'm talking about are these kind of adventures, as I call them. And I guess I'd like to start. I'm very interested. It sounds like you've been working for a long time in Vietnam, and I've been able to. I've interviewed biologists from Southeast Asia and people who work in China and Hong Kong, and I'm trying to think of some of the other places, Singapore, but like. But yeah, I've never really talked to anybody who spent a serious amount of time in Vietnam. So I'm very curious to hear about that. And I guess to kind of kick that off, um, I'm assuming that started before you retired, given I think the length of time you've been doing it. And like, how did that all start? Did you just have an interest in that region? Was there a particular a person or an event that kind of spurred you to start going to Vietnam looking for reptiles and amphibians?
Yeah, it was really just a lot of good fortune and then some goodwill from friends. So uh, a friend of mine, a very dear friend, Clarence Abercrombie from South Carolina, there works very closely with ARC and a lot of their projects, and taught over at Wofford College for many years, wildlife and statistics and whatnot. Um, he was on a sabbatical to Vietnam, and while he was there, he ran into a gentleman named Gert from the World Wildlife Fund, and while he was at Cat 10, and Gert was lamenting that they didn't have any herpetologists to do any surveys in the park. And Ab said, I know some guys. And so they started just around 2001, I think. And then they were there on and off during that period. And then I got invited to join in 2006. That was my first trip. And once we were there, that was finishing up those surveys in Cat 10, which was a absolutely amazing place for reptiles and amphibians. Just incredible. The
Before we get into that, though, where is Catian? What part of the country? Like, what's the
yeah.
general kind of like
Okay.
ecosystem?
So it's just north of Ho Chi Minh City or Saigon, and it's in tropical lowland forest, and
Okay.
so it's lowland rainforest, and just classic for especially for a desert boy like me, jungle uh, stuff, and not. I mean, the diversity is off the chart, but really habitats only vary. I mean, there might be bamboo thickets and stuff like that, and then some riverine habitats, but it's pretty homogeneous as far as the diversity of trees and plants that
Hmm.
you find throughout that region. And then usually shifts are elevational. As you move up in elevation, you get different cohorts of reptiles and amphibians and other fauna. Um, Not like out here where you've got strong riparian areas, or rocky slopes or something. It's
Hmm.
it's more of an elevation thing there.
Yeah, and so you start in 2006. I'm assuming this is something you do almost annually
Mhm.
now, and this is outside of your role with Game and Fish. I'm assuming this is
Yeah,
you're taking personal
absolutely.
time to do this, um,
Correct.
and so the real goal is to kind of inventory reptiles and amphibians in this park and just get a handle on what exists there. Is that accurate or?
Yeah, yeah. So the work at Cat 10 was up till 2006. Then we met some representatives from Wildlife at Risk, and they said, "Would you be interested in continuing the surveys?" Because we were literally wrapping up at Cat 10 in
Oh, okay.
2006, and then there was a 1 year hiatus, and then we started at Phu Quoc Island, did 2 years there. Then moved over to Vinh Cu, which is kind of adjacent to Cat 10, and then since that time have been all over the country, from the borders with neighboring countries, including China, way to the north, and so and the idea is doing these uh, surveying herp diversity, and we also do bats and some small mammal stuff, and then other biologists might be doing invertebrates or fish or orchids or whatever on these surveys, and to identify areas of greatest conservation need, and looking at places that they have set aside for diversity, and then also partnering with IEBR, which is like their U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and their biologists to basically get baseline data for these different spots.
Mm-hmm. So how much time, in an average year will you typically spend over there?
Yeah, so there's usually about 2 weeks, a little bit longer,
Okay.
and 10, 12 days are spent in the field, more or less, and depending on how far we have to travel and other logistics. But we get into some genuinely remote places, so we uh, might fly into Ho Chi Minh City or Hanoi, and then drive for a few hours in a van or something to get to another town, and then from there take a taxi kind of thing to the end of the line, and then get in a dump truck and drive right in the back of the dump truck for a half a day to the end of the road, and then meet porters there and head up to the top of a mountain and camp, and then maybe have a satellite camp from the base camp that we work out of and survey the areas.
Hey everybody, I just wanted to take a quick break and tell you that the Orianne Society is dedicated to protecting some of North America's most at-risk species and their habitats, like eastern indigo snakes in the longleaf savannas, eastern hellbenders in the Appalachian highlands, and wood turtles in the great northern forests. Healthy ecosystems depend on these incredible animals, but these landscapes and species need our help to survive. If you care about reptiles, amphibians, and the wild places they call home, visit www.orianne.org to learn more about our work and how you can get involved.
Sounds like quite an adventure. Well, you talked about. I'm sorry, I forgot the name of the first park there that you wrapped up in 2006, but
Cat 10.
Cat Tien, that's it. So you talked about that first park and actually kind of diversity of just kind of landscape habitat diversity being relatively low, pretty constant landscape, but having really had the opportunity, it sounds like, to survey really much of the country. I'd be curious, again, first just kind of starting with the landscapes and topography and forest types. Like if you're talking about Vietnam as a whole, how would you kind of characterize the diversity you've experienced in ecosystems and landscapes there?
Yeah, it's just off the chart, is what it is, and so um, uh, the I can't remember what the final count was for herps there at Cat 10, but on a typical night, you would see, when we were surveying working there, you would see half a dozen green vipers of two different species, but the taxonomy on Trimeresurus and wasn't worked out at that time. And in the time we've been doing that, they went from Trimeresurus to teletrops and back to Trimeresurus, and they've splintered it into a ton of different species, and so as you move around and you get into elevation or big different habitats, so you might move from tropical lowland forest to a marshy habitat, and then things start changing up again, and you get stuff like cylindrophus pipe snakes and a lot more water snakes, xenocrophus and things like that, and then you might move to an upland, fairly arid place where you pick up dibamus or a different green viper, and then on up to highland forest, where it still looks pretty much, to me, the untrained eye, a lot like that lowland forest, but it's much wetter and cooler, and you start seeing things like ovophus or protobothrops or Cyanomacuris. Bungrus seems to be widespread all through the area. We see a lot of Candidus, and but fasciata generally is down in the lowlands is when we encounter it, and that what we're seeing may not reflect the actual distributions of the animals, but those are the general things. A fair number of pythons, but no Burmese pythons, all reticulated, and
Okay.
they're all very unpleasant snakes to deal with. And so, yeah, lots of different things. Turtles very scarce. Cat 10 had an abundance of them because that was a focal point for repatriation of seized turtles. But traveling around the country, 2 years ago, I saw a turtle, and that was the first one in about human crickets almost 10 years.
And that's
That
not
we've seen.
it's not just from a lack of native diversity of turtles. That has to do with the decline in Southeast Asia in general from the trade and markets in China. Is that accurate?
That's exactly right. There was a tremendous diversity of turtles all over the country,
Mhm.
and some were truly abundant. But it is hard to find a turtle in there, and many of them are in dire need of conservation.
Do you see any other, like wildlife trade pressures on reptiles and amphibians? I know some of the pythons, for example, skins are important, but a lot of that has, those are more in like captive facilities these days. But is there any other major pressure that you're seeing on reptiles and amphibians in Vietnam, say akin to the turtle issue?
Yeah. So they, I've always had the impression, so please take this with the ignorance I'm expressing, but it seems like Vietnam is always, economically very challenged for a good part of the population, and somewhat protein starved. And so, you eat a lot of small fishes and other things that they would never consider eating in a country that lives in the opulence that we do. And so, um, uh, frogs, lots of different frogs are eaten. And when we're doing surveys, oftentimes we're working with some local crews, and we move into an area to work, and they'll start hunting frogs right away. And so we might see, some megaphriids and things like that for the first few nights, and then all the big ones and the odorana and Hylarana all disappear immediately around camp pretty quickly. And
Mm.
so it can be very hard on all wildlife when people are in need
Yeah.
and just looking to get make ends meet for their families and stuff like that. And so that friend that started these surveys, was the pivotal point. He once told me, and I think this is a really profound observation, that wildlife is a luxury for those who can afford it. And if you're living in a country where you're just worried about your kids surviving or where the next meal is coming from, conservation is one of the last things on your mind. And we're so fortunate to live in a country that has a lot of money and can devote so much of that towards conservation and saving species. And so many places around the world, that's not even a consideration. They're just trying to keep people alive.
Yeah.
And so Vietnam struggles with that somewhat. The biologists that are there are great. They're incredibly intelligent and proactive and engaged people, but it's a big place in a lot of remote areas.
Yeah, so much of conservation, especially, I've worked a lot in various parts of the world, but it has to do with that socioeconomic component. Exactly like you said. I mean, you know, conservation is low on people's list if they can't feed their children and put clothes on their backs. So glad you mentioned that. So I was going to ask you about conservation in general in Vietnam. So you mentioned some of those pressures kind of internally for, people collecting bushmeat or whatever you want to call it of all types. And then but you did mention there's parks, and you also mentioned um, WWF, which kind of has multiple wings, but is like a Western based conservation nonprofit. So what is kind of the conservation space in Vietnam look like? Are there a lot of local entities? Is it mostly kind of Western groups? Is it are these parks well protected, or are they heavily pressured by local communities? How does that all come together?
That's great. Great question. So they I my impression, and again, I apologize if if it's somewhat ignorant, but my impression is that you're really um, up and coming now. So people younger than I am, I'm an old guy, 67, but we're talking, people in their 30s, very early 40s right now. Some older folks, and then a lot of younger folks really are the first conservation generation in Vietnam, where you're seeing a lot of people really engaged in wildlife and wildlife conservation and what it means to, or these pressures mean to those wildlife. That said, they're they've got several national parks and set asides that are well managed. They've got forest guards that live at stations there that patrol these areas and keep people, keep people with bad intentions out. But it's really, a lot of the country's so remote. I remember walking up a trail in Quang Ngai province, and way out in the middle of nowhere. And I'd been out for several hours climbing up these trails on these mountain ridges. Bumped into two gentlemen carrying a live deer on their back. Deer was probably, I don't know, 150, 160 pounds. It's trussed up alive, and they had snared it obviously, and were heading down to the village, to slaughter it. And we find snares quite frequently out in the field, and we run into people collecting things. And sometimes we'll buy the animals from them, and release them, for what little good that does. I'm sure that makes zero impact, but it helps assuage our consciences and doing what little you can. But anything you can catch and sell, even if it's for almost nothing, that's still a couple bucks you didn't have. And so it's an incredibly difficult problem with a bunch of super smart, very dedicated people trying to tackle so too few people, really good people trying to tackle an enormous problem.
Yeah.
And here with all the resources we have, look at the stuff we struggle with, and think of cutting those down to almost nothing, and trying to surmount worse problems.
Yeah. How are some of the big Western, you mentioned WWF, but I think Wildlife Conservation Society might also have a presence there, and some others. How are the big kind of Western NGO conservation, wildlife conservation nonprofits? How do they fit in, and how are they viewed by the local people in terms of conservation? Is it welcomed, or is it, kind of antagonistic?
I think it's very welcome. So I think we're all quick to recognize allies when we meet them, and so I think Vietnam very much appreciates additional resources that are pointed towards your country, and to help them tackle conservation issues. And that's been my impression on the whole. The World Wildlife Fund and Turtle Survival Alliance are the main ones I've kind of rubbed shoulders with a little bit, but we're usually working kind of independent, so we don't have a lot of representatives there from other NGOs. There was a virologist there one year working with us before the pandemic, and he was taking samples from the bats we had, and he was from Yugoslavia, and they were looking for the next big pandemic. And I talked to him after it hit here and said, "Did you find it?" And he goes, "Nope, but over in Cambodia, there's something a lot like it, and we're keeping an eye on it." So, lots of people doing lots of work with different things, and the Vietnamese government has been wonderful for the most part, just very helpful.
You mentioned reticulated pythons, which we've done a whole episode on, retics in the wild, and then you mentioned some of the vipers, and I think one of the pipe snakes. But how would you the snake communities in Vietnam? Obviously, we've talked about it's a diverse country. There's mountains, there's ocean, it's just a diverse place. But how would you characterize kind of the snake communities across Vietnam, and maybe what are some of those those species that really kind of jump out at you for whatever reason, whether it be really common or really colorful or really big? But like, what are some of those kind of flagship species in your head that people might have interest in?
Yeah. One of the, when I think of Vietnam, right away I go to the green vipers, the Crotaliotrops. And that's because they are such a conspicuous animal. It is rare that we don't see them, or I should say it's rare that we don't see a lot of those. And like I said, a common night in Cat 10 was 6 green vipers, is 2 different species. Generally, most places I go, I can expect to see anywhere from 2 to 4 a night. Out ambushing, and mainly frogs,
And
but they're also
would they be up in vegetation, arboreal like, or are they typically on the ground?
yeah. Think of eyelash vipers
Mm-hmm.
and behaviors like that. So I do see them occasionally on the ground, but often when they're on the ground, they're moving someplace or something. So they're crossing a trail or something, but they may be ambushing just with their heads just inches above the ground, and but quite common to see them up in vine tangles and stuff. And if anybody has any experience with any of the Bothricus, like lateralis, or mini horn or horn vipers, they are very much like that. So all the palm vipers and the bamboo vipers, they're basically ecological equivalents doing very much the same thing. And if you've seen them in Central America or Latin America, seen them in Vietnam, and the way they're behaving is very much the same thing. So we did a little bit of work with some Bothricus on the Soropta Peninsula in Panama when I was over there teaching a tropical ecology class with a very dear friend, and they continued some of the work after I was gone. But what they basically found was these eyelash vipers would ambush, and as soon as they got something to eat, they'd go right to the top of the canopy, digest it, and then come down and a period later. And far as we can tell from looking at all these Crotaliotrops, they're doing exactly the same thing. Once they eat, they are just gone. Huh. But they'll maintain an ambush position for a week or more on end until they get a meal. So, but they're quite common and very conspicuous when you're walking around at night. Don't see them during the day, but anybody that's looked for green snakes in hedgerows back east or anything like that knows about lights and snakes and how much easier they are to see that way.
Yeah. Gotcha. How about any other kind of notable species or groups of species that you would share with the audience?
Yeah, we get a fair number of Calliophis, which are little Mucurus type thing, little a lapid deal, and some of them are very pretty and have nice displays like a ringneck snake. We see a lot of Dinodon / Lycodon. Those have all been lumped, and they look. Some of them are just amazing mimics of Bungarus, especially Candidus, and I always have a long, hard look at them before I pick them up. Don't want to make a Slowinski mistake. None of us do. Protobothrops can be very common in some places. We get a fair number of water snakes, depending if we're low enough and in the river valleys and whatnot. The retics often, crossing paths or things like that, or just laying in the bottom of creeks. And we spend a lot of time wading up creeks because oftentimes the forest is just too thick to move through. You would just be macheting your way constantly, and that's not a good way to look for things hanging on vegetation when you're trying to chop it down to get it through it. So hunting the edges of creeks is a great way. So we your feet are wet all the time. You're wading up and down these things nearly constantly. And if it's precipitate enough, you climb a lot of waterfalls, which is kind of unpleasant when they're real slick and whatnot. But just a lot of slug eaters of different types, 2 different types. And what else do we see? We see Goniocephalus in some of the lower habitats, and Calloselasma, um, uh, which is kind of like a little cottonmouth copperhead kind of thing. Um, uh, you know, uh, some of the how come the name's slipping me right now? But anyway, cat-eyed snakes can be quite abundant sometimes, and so diversity is just so marvelous. Any one night you might see, on a good night, 8 snakes and 4 or 5 different genera.
Wow. So you're going to this incredibly diverse place. You're hitting different, diversity of ecosystems across the country, and looking, kind of doing a general inventory for reptiles and amphibians, an incredibly, again, diverse place. How do you, what are the resources you use to learn in these places? Are there many books and websites and whatever it might be, resources that help you identify these species, or has that been a real challenge over time?
Hey everybody, I just wanted to take a break and tell you guys that snakes are one of the most persecuted groups of animals in the world, but we are dedicated to changing that. The Orianne Society works every day to ensure there's a future for these amazing animals. If you care about snakes, wildlife, or wild places, and you like what you've been hearing on the Snake Talk podcast, support us today by donating on our website at www.orianne.org.
That's a great question. Yeah, and it's been a nightmare. Uh, when we were started, there was basically one green viper in Cat 10, and we kept trying to lump them together. And I remember, was taking lots of measurements and photos of the heads and counting labials and all this kind of stuff. And then the red-eyed one that Rubius was described, and again they've been split up so seriously. Literature has been a real problem, and so we've got a kind of a bank we've established, and so where we constantly are just amassing this literature. Microhylids, holy cow! There's a blue million of those things down there, and some of them are just microscopic. I mean, smaller than your little fingernail, and so these. Figuring out what you've got where, and then the frustration of the dynamics of taxonomy, where things are shifting and trying to keep up with those names and stuff. So the raccophorids, things like Polypodades has changed to megacephalus, and now this one's only found there, and this one's not down here, and all that kind of stuff. So I look up at my shelf while we're talking at my field notes, and the misinformation in there because of changed taxonomy is formidable, because I've never gone back and corrected all those names, and sometimes these things no longer even exist. They've been lumped and sunk and stuff like that. So yeah, it's problematic for sure.
Yeah. Who is the herpetologist in Florida? Paul
Moeller, dear friend of mine.
Yeah, I was going to ask this. Do you guys go together? Because I know he's been going to Vietnam.
Yeah, so Paul predates me in Vietnam. He was one of the original few that went. And so Paul and I are dear friends. My first trip to Africa was with Paul, and we've gone together many times. Matter of fact, he's in Africa right now at Korkaboom Biological Station. And we travel a lot together. And so Paul is one of the folks that got me on board with the Vietnam trips, but I'm good friends with everybody that's working there. So it's mainly been Wayne Van Demeter, Ab Abercrombie, Chris Hope, and Paul and myself. And then other biologists have joined us from time to time, but we're the kind of core crew that have been doing the work there.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, so we've talked a lot about Vietnam, but you also mentioned some other things. I think you mentioned teaching in, maybe it was Central America, and I think I mentioned that you spent some time working with National Geographic. Maybe we don't need to get into as much depth, but I'm just curious to hear about some of these other adventures and kind of how you got into those. Did they spur off of the work in Vietnam, or something else?
Yeah, I'm one of those lucky guys that have kind of forced gump my way through life, and somehow things have turned to roses. Not everything, but been very, very fortunate. So, really engaged in the biological scene here, and in '93 I started working with some of the natural history films. Matter of fact, I just finished up with one in Tucson, a 22-day stint filming kangaroo rats with them, and there were some herps in that. There will be some herps in that thing that I handled for them. And so working and consulting on these things with these film crews, and a lot of the series that you may or may not be familiar with, I've worked on. And National Geographic at one point was looking for people to help lead tours there. And since I'd done stuff in Central America, that was where I primarily worked out of, was Costa Rica. And so I would be basically the trip's naturalist on these National Geographic tours. And so I went to the Amazon, mainly Central America, and then also to Namibia with them. And they were great trips. They were 10-day affairs, and you rub shoulders with generally a bunch of great people that were on the trip, and talked about wildlife and ecology and things like that with them. So did that for several years, and then they kind of shifted over to people that had actually got National Geographic grants and did research, and those became their cadre of naturalists. And so kind of phased out of that. And then I don't even remember what your other part of the question was.
Oh, I referenced you said you were teaching in Central America was the other example I gave. So
yeah. So Institute of Tropical Ecology down in on Bocas del Toro in Panama had a field herpetology class, and one of my dear friends from college, Tom Jones, who's the state herpetologist here in Arizona, he was going down and said, would you be interested in helping out with this, and co-teaching this with me? So I went down with him, and we spent 6 weeks on the island there, and we had a bunch of students come in from different universities. We marked and recaptured caimans. We started that eyelash viper project. We basically did leaf litter surveys and lots of amphibian work there, and just had a wonderful time, and working with Pete Lahanis and some other folks there at the field station, and then of course rubbing shoulder with primate people and everybody else that was working there. It was a great time, and really nice and immersive, which I enjoyed immensely.
That sounds great. So, as you talked about, I can't remember how you worded it, but you've been, very lucky. You've been, just had a great life and been able to experience so many things, but you're still relatively young, and, still have some years ahead of you. So what does the future look like? You're done with the state wildlife agency work, but I'm assuming you've got adventures on your mind. Are you continuing the Vietnam work? Do you have other places that you plan on going and exploring? What does the future hold?
Yeah, so I'm still engaged with the state wildlife department quite a bit, because I have a lot of peers over there like Jim and Tom Jones and others that I work with on different things. Right now, I'm in the middle of one of the poorest decisions I made in my life, and that was to try to develop a key to larval amphibians of Arizona.
Oh.
And so, yeah, there you go. That says it all. And so, third year on that project, and it has been very problematic, and difficult, and may not be able to be done. But last year alone, I handled over 1,000 tadpoles of what 25 different species or so here in the state. And right now, out on my porch, I've got probably a couple hundred tadpoles starting out this year. And I'll hit about a 2,000-mile loop in the state collecting tadpoles here next week starting.
Yeah.
And so, and then for the summer range. So that's been taking an inordinate amount of my time.
Yeah. How, yeah, I'm sure you're very familiar with it, but didn't Roy McDermott have a larval amphibian book?
Yeah, Altig and McDermott.
Yeah, that's right.
Ron Altig has done several different publications, and McDermott was on some of those, or several of them. It turns out, with no disrespect for those gentlemen, that the labial tooth row counts and the oral disc formulas that they developed do not hold up well here in Arizona. And I'm just trying to do an Arizona key. I don't even want to look at a tadpole from anywhere else for the rest of my life.
Oh, come on. Maybe you should do one for the amphibians of Vietnam or something.
Absolutely not. I don't even have enough fingers and toes, and I'm pretty seriously deformed to come anywhere near counting the variety there. So, yeah, it's really, I can't imagine, and I think, I've referenced their work and relied on it pretty heavily, but some of these things are just all over the map, and it's not even having to do with chytrid, deformities to the tooth rows or stuff. It's just variability within the species, and so looking at more at gestalt and subtle characters that we can do it. So we can do a key to the families very easily, but when you start getting to species specific, like our bufonids or ranids, it becomes much more problematic. And so still no way to tell plain spadefoots from Mexican spadefoots, as far as I can tell. Looked at a pile of those things.
Huh. So you're continuing the work locally on the larval amphibians. I'm assuming you're going to continue traveling to Vietnam for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I hope so. Things after COVID, things became a little shook up and difficult, but trying to get those things back on their feet. So we're hoping that continues. I've been doing a lot of stuff in Africa. So I assisted Aaron Bauer and Trip Lamb on their review of pachydaculid geckos, collecting geckos and other herps in Namibia and South Africa on several trips, and then have continued to go there working with a good friend, Johan Murray, who runs the African Snakebite Institute, and was just there a little while ago, did a trip up to Angola, or the Angola border, I should say. And so hoping to do a lot more of that, but really looking forward to next year getting to Borneo and Sumatra, the Komodo Islands, and that part of Southeast Asia that I haven't seen yet. And looking forward to doing something there and just kind of playing tourist and looking at animals.
Yeah, that sounds great. Well, it sounds like you have a long, interesting future ahead of you. And it's been great talking to you. But before we say goodbye, I like to have all of my guests tell me a story. So let's imagine that you and I are out some faraway place, maybe in Vietnam or Southeast Asia, and we're sitting around a campfire at night, and I turn to you and I ask you to tell me your best snake story.
Wow, that's a heck of a challenge. So I'm going to preface this with the way a twisted perspective on the world, and that is I never really use the term of adventure, because an adventure has to have a high element of the risk of death to be an adventure by name. So that's one of those overused words in my my view, and if you think about it, all the best adventure stories you ever read, people die or are hanging by a thread through the whole thing. So seeing something or nearly stepping on something or accidentally grabbing something, really isn't an adventure. It's more along, just being in the field and doing stuff. That said, I think one of the snake encounters that impressed me most was about there were two. One was probably a 7 foot, 8 foot uh, um, fer-de-lance in Panama that we looked for, had been seen in the area, we were looking for it, and myself and everybody else, and there were many of us looking for it, all stepped within a foot of the snake, and before we finally found it, about an hour later, under this big mat of vines. Of course, it wanted nothing to do with us, but boy, it was a beautiful and magnificent animal. The other one was in Vietnam, and about a 9 foot plus Ophiophagus Hannah, and she's on a nest, and you would walk towards her, and she'd uncoil from the nest and come out, leaving her tail on the nest, then rear up to maybe I'm not a tall guy, so a little bit higher than waist height to me, and confront you. And then everywhere you walked, of course, she would pivot and turn and just watch you and just, really made it clear you don't want to come over here and mess with this nest. And she was beautiful. So a magnificent snake.
Yeah, what an experience. How common were they in Vietnam? Did you see them often, or?
No, unfortunately, we very seldom see cobras. We see good numbers of lots of other venomous snakes, especially green vipers. But cobras, we've only seen a few times. And that's always kind of puzzled me. And that's the only king cobra we really came across, was her. And that was down kind of in the southern area called Seven Temples. And she was up on top of this god-awful little pointed mountain or hill, and in a thick bamboo forest. And so, but never forget it. Just a really beautiful, magnificent animal in a beautiful place.
Yeah. Well, Randy, thank you. I enjoyed, hearing and sharing a little bit about, all these experiences that you've had throughout your life. Sounds like, you've had a great life, and sounds like it'll continue. So again, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much. I had a great time.
And great. I just wanted to thank the audience and tell everybody to remember, snakes are animals too, and it's a privilege to see one in the wild.